All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cultural History of Wetlands in Coastal South Carolina. Thank you all very much for taking the time to join us. My name is Maeve Snyder. I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the North Inlet Winyah Bay Reserve, which is part of the University of South Carolina and located in Georgetown. The webinar today was developed with partners from Clemson Extension and South Carolina Sea Grant. So I want to give the opportunity for the rest of the planning team to give an introduction. Brooke, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Brooke Sari. I'm with South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, and we've been planning this webinar for quite a while, and we're happy that we're finally able to bring it to everybody. And this will be one of two sessions. And so thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from our speakers today.
Hey everybody, I'm Amy Scaroni. I'm an assistant professor of watershed management with Clemson and also an extension specialist with Clemson Extension. And I'm so excited to see so many of you on the line for our fantastic lineup of speakers. So thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Thanks, Brooke and Amy. And I'll introduce our wonderful speakers in just a minute. But I wanted to start with a few reminders and tips for the webinar today. The first is just to note that we are using Zoom webinar, and you should see a panel at the bottom of your screen that looks like this. The main thing to know is that we're not going to use this raise hand button today. We're going to use this Q&A chat box, and you can ask questions at any time throughout the webinar. However, we are going to save questions for the end during a Q&A with all our speakers. If you're having any technical difficulties, the best bet is to leave and rejoin the webinar through the same link. All right, if you are interested in receiving continuing education credits for the webinar today, here is the information for how to do that. First, you need to be present for the entire webinar. Zoom will give us a report so I can tell when you join and leave, so I'll know. We also need you to complete a brief evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. You'll get a link where you can then download the certificate, and then you will need to fill in your name and submit it to your professional association for credits. Please do not share or forward that certificate link. And also please note, we cannot provide a certificate if you're only dialed in by phone. So if you called in today, try to join on a computer or a tablet or something with a screen. All right, we're going to do a quick poll to get our mental energy back after lunch. So the first question is asking, what is your favorite type of wetland in South Carolina? And this is not a comprehensive list. If you have a different one, you could put it in the Q&A box. All right, I still see questions coming in. Oh, are y'all able to see the answer now? Okay, it looks like the winner was salt marshes, but these are all wonderful wetland habitats. All right, we're going to take one more quick poll. And this question is just asking, what is your affiliation or background? This is really helpful for us and our speakers to know who is in the audience today. Oh, hang on, I wasn't trying to hit. Okay, I think it's reopened. Okay, the polls are being quirky today, but I appreciate everyone who is able to respond. Sorry if it's jumping ahead. It looks like most folks are in local or state government, but we've got a broad range of backgrounds. Moving on from our quirky polls, here is an overview of our webinar today. Again, I want to thank our planning partners who helped to organize this event. And as background, we wanted to focus on this topic because wetlands are incredibly important ecosystems. We spent a lot of time talking about the various ecosystem services they provide. These are things like improving water quality, flood mitigation, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration. And usually at the end of this list, there's a mention of cultural benefits. The idea for today is to put these wetland cultural connections at the forefront and hopefully gain a deeper understanding of what they mean in the context of our work or decisions. So for example, if you primarily interact with wetlands as a natural resource or through the natural sciences, I hope this will give some perspective on the human history of the ecosystems where you work. Or if you primarily work with communities or stakeholders, you might gain some insights into the role that wetlands have played in shaping human culture and society. So like we saw, there are a lot of different backgrounds in our audience today, but I'm really excited that we have some wonderful speakers who are going to address this topic from a variety of different angles. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kim Long. And Kim, I am gonna pull up your presentation. In just one moment. All right, is that the correct view?
It's not in presentation mode yet, Maeve.
It's not. Do I need to switch the?
Maybe it just needs to be full screen.
Oh. It is for me. Okay, hang on. Sorry, y'all, bear with me. I've got 4 PowerPoints open at once. All right, how about now?
That
All
is
right,
actually presenter view. Perfect.
That better?
Yes,
All right, Kim, just let me know when to advance.
I will. Are you ready for me?
Yes,
Okay.
take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me so much pleasure to be here today to talk about one of my favorite subjects. I would like to start by saying I am also executive director of the Lowcountry Rice Project, which was founded by acclaimed artist Jonathan Green. Jonathan Green and I have been business partners and friends for the last 30 years or so. And so a lot of the research for the Lowcountry Rice Culture Project we developed together. And as we studied more about the Lowcountry rice culture and the residuals here in the Lowcountry, we realized that we had to go back even further into the African culture of maritime. So what I'm going to do today is set the background from the African culture that eventually came to the Lowcountry in the form of Gullah Geechee culture. So you can advance to the first slide, please. I'm not going to read this verbatim. This is a matter of reference for me, and I'm happy to share it with anyone that's interested in it. But it was known by historians that Africans have especially coastal areas, have a long reputation as swimmers, divers, surfers, and even boat builders. They were building these huge canoes, massive trees that would hold 30 to 50 people. And this is how they connected to markets around Africa as well as the rest of the world, years before others were navigating the world. Next slide. So we're really, what we're talking about here that has occurred in the maritime and in our coastal waters are all related to economics. So let's talk from an economic standpoint. And I want to go long before the triangular trade, which is what most of America's history centers around. But that was just a midpoint in the history. And so we have to talk about these ancient trade routes that were taking people all over the world for exploration and also for economic expansion. And the trade began first as spice trade and other looking for salt. Europeans were looking for salt. There was a disparity in the wealthy and the not so resourced in having ways to preserve food. And so when the Portuguese came around the Cape of Good Hope, targeting, trying to find a route to India to get direct access to the spices, is when they realized the resources and assets in Africa, and also began trading. The Europeans began trading with Africa, because before then, Africa had been trading with Asia and the Arab countries for many years. So as the Europeans began trading is when Africans were already enslaving other tribal members of other tribes and bringing the humans to introduce the trade of humans for whatever goods the Portuguese were bringing. Next slide, please. So we have evidence, historians, that, for instance, with Christopher Columbus was Pedro Nina, an African Spaniard who traveled with him because he had pre-existed in terms of as an explorer. And so we see evidence that Africans have been involved with other civilizations and were present in many countries. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So anyway, all of this world interaction and trade created the first global economy, which brings us to the point that we now are starting to see colonies form in America. Next, please. So, as the colonies are forming in America, we know that Barbados had already had enslavement of Africans. There was sugar primarily. Sugar was a huge driver in the international trade. And sugar, I just came back from a trip to Rhode Island, and where I was looking at African-American maritime history there with a group of people. And when we were in Rhode Island, they as we talk about rice here, they speak about rum. So the sugar was coming from the Caribbean to Rhode Island. They were making rum. Rum was then going to Africa, being traded for humans. And after the Barbadians realized that our low country looked fertile for the rice cultivation, they then started trading for West Africans to come and cultivate rice here in the Lowcountry. So rice became the drivers, and then there became this need to bring in more and more people, because as I think most of the people here know, that rice was the product, along with indigo and Sea Island cotton, that made Charleston the wealthiest city much of the world. So now I want to center what I'm going to talk about in the Gullah Geechee culture. Next slide, please. So we have rice, and we have these West Africans here cultivating the rice, and many of them isolated out on the Sea Islands, which really determined that culture of Gullah Geechee that we see, and which is more so a language, because we had Africans coming from a multitude of countries on the continent of Africa. So they had to create this Creole language that so they could communicate, that was made up of the African and even some Spanish words and the English language. So in terms of Gullah Geechee, they're really Africans, and that retained a large, probably the most intact population of Africans that came to these shores in terms of the African language. So the Gullah Geechee became a self-contained maritime culture, meaning they were deriving most of their food from the water. Most of the industry was around the water, and rice as an agricultural element of the maritime. And from that, and the rice plantations grew this culture that influenced many of the residuals that we find here in the Lowcountry now. The foodways, the language, the craftsmanship. We find the sweetgrass baskets that are made, and they were more of a utility item in those days, and they used them for everything, even moving earth. They use those as tools. So as we look at the Gullah Geechee culture and the cultivation of rice, it's all surrounded by this, what I call a watery kingdom that we live in. We live in this watery empire of the Lowcountry. Next slide, please. We had influence on the foodways from the African enslaved cooks. They were given these recipes, the European recipes, and then they interpreted those recipes according to their customs. And these culinary traditions continued. But as we look at our maritime communities and the people within those maritime communities, we see where many of the foods that are still on menus and restaurants, how they evolved as a natural resource: oysters, shrimp, fish, and other delicacies that came from the sea. Next slide, please. So among the rice plantations, as we look at all the waterways here in the Lowcountry, the boat captains were enslaved Africans, and they had the job of moving the raw products to the port, generally in Charleston. The other large ports were Savannah and Georgetown in this area, and Beaufort. They moved the raw products with pretty much autonomy. So they were able to share information and what we call rebellious communications for escapes and other illicit trades on the Maroon Islands, that were people that they were seeking freedom, and they were helping these people escape the plantations, the boat captains, with the autonomy, and moving them to Maroon Islands where they were building ships or canoes and spirited themselves away to the ports and then escaped by maritime means. We have to realize that the major transportation system was by maritime boats, patroons, canoes, and then we became steamships later. So all of the transportation for moving the raw products to the northern colonies where they were manufactured was in the maritime, by maritime means. Next slide. So as we look at Charleston as the fourth largest city in colonial America and the wealthiest, we can see this groundswell of people, humans, that interacted very closely with the natural resources, with the waterways, the wetlands. And this was since the settlement of Charleston in 1670. So all of this southern Atlantic seaboard was propelled by this maritime commerce. Next slide. Charleston was a very busy port. If we look now around on the peninsula where I was this morning, and you're crossing the bridges and the waterways, we see all kinds of boats. We see passenger boats, we see freight being transported by ships, and we see cruise ships. We have seen cruise ships and other indicators of our port and our maritime system. But in those days, when you went around Charleston, Savannah, and Jacksonville, anywhere on the Lowcountry coastal areas, there was a predominance of ships on any given day, indicating active trading, active commerce, which the Port of Charleston dominated this trade. Next slide, please. We know that the Africans were the labor force. So you see a lot of these workers in maritime trades. You see them more so in maritime trades than any other industry. And here in Charleston particularly, you saw a multitude of enslaved persons moving cargo on and off ships as they were coming. This gave them an opportunity to secret away freedom seekers. And in doing so, those people were able to escape. We found that 70% of the Underground Railroad was conducted by water versus terrestrial routes, which had been previously understood. There was no way that freedom seekers could escape from the South and make it to the North without the navigation of these ships. So next slide, please.
And Kim, just a heads up, we want to wrap up in the next minute or two.
All right, thank you. So in wrapping up, I want to say that here we have little that remains of this whole maritime history. We have the residuals. We know we have the rice fields. We know that the rice was cultivated here. But with the numbers and types of ships that were present in Charleston during the colonial age, we realized that we really don't know a lot about the culture of the people who were dominant in terms of the numbers of the population. At one point, it was 80% African to 20% European. And so these influences we're still discovering and unearthing. And I thank everyone for their time and attention today. And I appreciate being able to have this time to talk. on African American maritime history.
Thank you so much, Kim. As I said before, if you have questions for any of our speakers, you can put a question in the Q&A box at any point during the presentation, and we'll come back to them at the end. So thank you again, and we're gonna move to our next presentation with Travis Folk. And Travis, I'm gonna pull up your talk next.
Great.
All right, looking good?
Yep, looks perfect. Thank you.
All right,
I appreciate the invitation. I am my name is Travis Folk. I'm a wildlife biologist in the ACE Basin of South Carolina, and primarily work with historic rice fields, both the restoration, wetland permitting, and the management of these rice fields. This is going to be, I'm going to assume that many folks understand or have generally heard of the importance of rice as a commodity crop along for coastal South Carolina, and really at a larger scale, a little bit into North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. I've been doing this work for some time, and I was asked a question about 4 or 5 years ago. So, well, if we understand that rice fields are important both historically and now in the 20th and 21st century, they're important ecologically for managing wildlife habitat, where are they and how many acres of rice fields were there? And we don't know. That prompted my other collaborators here on the screen, Dr. Andrew Bridges, now previously Dr. Ernie Wiggers with the Nemours Wildlife Foundation, Dr. Rob Baldwin with Clemson, to start this mapping process, to begin to systematically understand where are these rice fields in South Carolina. I want to acknowledge the partners across the bottom. Many of these are members of the ACE Basin Task Force, and when we first got this project started, those entities provided some seed money to begin this project. Can the next slide. So this obviously is a rice field. This is along the Combahee River. If you're driving down Highway 17 towards Beaufort and you glance off to the right, that's what you look at. We understand just by just very brief examination of Google Earth or spending time in the Lowcountry, that rice has had a huge impact on the landscape and the morphology of coastal wetlands. We understand, obviously, it was motivated as a commodity crop, and it was created by slaves, managed by slaves, tended by slaves for hundreds of years. Next slide. But then after rice declined as a commodity crop in the late 1800s, these plantations began to be purchased by Northerners who were looking for a place that didn't have quite as much snow as New York, Connecticut, places further north, but also provided some sporting opportunity. And many of these rice fields and plantations were turned into waterfowl properties. Through the 20th century, we've also understood that while we do provide great waterfowl habitat, also provides incredible habitat for wood storks, wading birds, a whole host of other species that depend on these managed wetlands. Kind of next slide. In general, there are two types of rice fields. There's the tidal rice fields, which you can see here, and those are generally rice fields that were constructed along the edge of freshwater tidal rivers. So these tidal rice fields are situated in certain areas of the coast where the river is, the section of river is far enough inland, it's freshwater, but it's close enough that it's also subject to tidal forces. So it's true tidal freshwater. These are the rice fields that many folks are familiar with. Can I have the next slide? This is another layout of tidal rice fields, some of which are still intact, others are not. And this form of tidal rice culture started in the 1750s, but really didn't reach really get going until after the American Revolution. And of course, this was the predominant form of rice culture through the 1800s to the Civil War. Next slide, please. Prior to that, though, were the first form of economically successful rice culture is what we call inland rice fields. And in this aerial photo, you can see kind of that darker strip going in a north-south orientation. That obviously is a rice field, and on either side are uplands. These inland rice fields started in the late 1600s all the way through the 1700s and were gravity-fed freshwater wetlands. If you look closely, you can see a series of dikes that go across these forested wetlands. Imagine this primordial cypress tupelo swamp that was that the colonists encountered. They leveled these trees. They then diked off the rice field and then allowed them to start planting rice and passing water through the system. Next slide. We knew about these inland rice fields, some of them, but we didn't really know where they were. The previous slide is relatively easy to look at and understand. The second slide that we're looking at now, you can maybe see some dikes, but you're not quite sure. Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, if I can have the next slide, the most recent round of LIDAR data was made available. LIDAR is nothing more than a satellite with a laser that goes across, covers the landscape with a series of laser returns. It's nothing more than akin to strapping a depth finder from your boat onto a satellite that goes around the Earth. Previously, LIDAR has been around for some time, and previously the resolution worked great if you were in the mountains, but here on the coast, where a matter of inches means the difference between being dry and wet. The LIDAR finally reached that level of resolution a handful of years ago, and we realized that, in fact, it would be suitable to begin to understand where are these rice fields, especially inland fields. If I can have the next slide. This is an example. You would look at it and say, well, I see a lot of trees, I see a couple of roads, maybe 2 or 3 houses, but I don't see much more than that. There is an inland rice field there. If I can have the next slide. As we begin to look at LIDAR, we can look through the canopy and begin to see this geometric layout of these inland rice fields, especially. If I can have the next slide. And this is just another depiction of this landscape. Here you can see in the upper left-hand corner, obviously a 20th century road, but the majority of what all of these other straight and parallel lines that you see are both the canals, dikes, and quarter drains across these rice fields. We went through a systematic process over 3 or 4 summers where we had interns looking at this sort of data, aerial photography, soils maps, to begin to map out where are these rice fields. If I can have the next slide. And it resulted in data that looked like this. I want to draw your attention to 2 things here. One is you can see several rivers, and the larger blocks of green, or those are the tidal rivers along those, the Combee and the Ashpoo and the Edisto that we're looking at here. But you can also see these serpentine, small, narrow rice fields that penetrate into the uplands. Those are inland rice fields. This was incredibly illuminating. Everybody knows about the rice fields along the major rivers, Santee Delta, the Savannah River, but it was these inland rice fields that really opened up everybody's eyes to the point of, wow, how many acres are actually out there? If I can have the next slide. At the end of the day, we came up with 236,000 acres of rice fields in South Carolina. More amazing than that was inland rice fields were nearly, just by a smidge, nearly half of the total acreage. Again, if you spend any time in coastal South Carolina, these tidal rice fields are big. They're along the rivers. We've got a lot of rivers. Therefore, I think intuitively all of us thought that the majority of the acreage would be tidal rice fields. But in fact, inland rice fields are half the acreage, essentially. If you can go to the next slide. This is a slide of coastal South Carolina. You can see the distribution of these rice fields. Just briefly, I'll talk, if you start up towards Murrells Inlet, there really aren't any, well, there aren't any rice fields of large acreage in Horry County, but you begin to pick them up in Georgetown, going up towards Plantersville, coming down through Winyaw Bay. By and large, from the Santee Delta north, those are all tidal rice fields. You don't have the elevation, the flat topography the way we do here south of Charleston for the inland rice to really be likely. As you begin to come south through McClellanville and Allendale, you begin to pick up more inland rice fields. Certainly the east branch of the Cooper and west branch of the Cooper, on further up the Wando, you pick up tidal fields, and then further in up those stretches, more inland fields. As you come south out of Charleston, that's where you really begin to see inland rice fields through areas like above Ravenel, Jacksonboro, Cottageville, Green Pond, Whitehall, Yemassee. That's where you see the abundance of inland rice fields. And right there around Jacksonboro, you can see that spider network. The Port Royal Sound is one of the deepest sounds along the East Coast, which means that you have a huge tidal push further inland. That was one factor that restricted the development of rice fields further up above Ridgeland. And of course, the Savannah River, there are tidal rice fields there. I'll mention as a side note, we currently this summer are mapping out the rice fields in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And by the end of the summer, we'll have the rest of that data. But here in South Carolina, this number of 236,000 acres was astonishing. Can I go to the next slide? I'm not sure how many of you deal with the notion of acres. Obviously, 236 sounds like a large number. But the very next question is, well, these were created by the hands of slaves. So what does that mean in terms of placing the creation of rice fields here in coastal South Carolina on par with other massive earth modification projects through mankind? What does this mean? So we went back into the data set and imagine this picture right here where we have a cypress tupelo swamp. Imagine taking that to that very first slide that you saw, very flat, treeless landscape, diked, canals, water control structures. It's an incredible, difficult, laborious, and dangerous job. Can you have the next slide? We went back into those polygons and said, okay, we have the acreage, but what about the volume of dirt? If we could get to a notion of volume of dirt, we could place it on par with other projects around the world through civilization, through time. We went back into the data and we extracted the linear footage of all the dikes. If I can go to the next slide. This is the dike layout along the Combahee River. Tidal rice fields are here in purple, green, or in inland fields. Then if I can go to the Santee Delta, the next slide, which is the Santee Delta. Again, you see this incredible hydraulic machine and all of these lines. Well, geometrically, if you understand the linear footage of all of these dikes, and from some of the planters' diaries and other references, we generally know max and a min on the cross section, the trapezoidal area of dikes. You can begin to make some pass at what did slaves touch with their hands to make these rice fields. Right now, we're somewhere between 70 and 80 million cubic yards of material. To place that on par with other projects, the Suez Canal was roughly, I think, 90 or 95 million. The Panama Canal, which the French started with steam shovels, was just over 300 million cubic yards. So you can see that this was spatially and from an effort was a massive accomplishment by the hands of slaves to transform these coastal wetlands into these rice fields. And as an amateur historian and a wildlife biologist, it's fascinating to me that this component of our history, our cultural fabric history and our history of the Lowcountry has such huge conservation significance for managing wildlife habitat into the 20th and 21st century. So with that, I will wrap up.
Thank you very much, Travis. All right. As a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A box. I see we've got a few coming in and we will come back to those at the end. But for now, I want to introduce our final speaker, Marilyn Hemingway. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, can't turn my video on, so I'm
Oh,
the
I
problem
just fixed
child.
it. You should be good now.
Thank you,
Do you want me to
you.
pull up your presentation or did you want to share it yourself?
Oh, you can pull it up. I think I'll be like everyone else, right? For the
All
for the
right, we'll
moment.
see how I do. I'm 0 for 2 right now with getting the presentation
I'm
right.
prepared.
All right, here we go.
All right,
Oh,
and
let me go back.
all the way to the
There.
top. All right, there you go. Well, good afternoon. I'm like fascinated listening to Ms. Long and Mr. Folk and the information that they have provided. I learn every time I come to something like this. So I think my part is kind of modernize the information that they've shared to what's going on now. I am Marilyn Hemingway, founding president of the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce and the Gullah Geechee Chamber Foundation. And the Chamber of Commerce was started to create global awareness, profitability, and sustainability of African-American businesses and other entities impacting the Gullah Geechee community, as you can see on the screen. It's not too hard to create global awareness because we are already a global community. You find us in the Caribbean islands, you find us in North America, and you find us in South America. In particular, in South America, more enslaved ancestors were taken to South America. So basically, we're all cousins. May not be aware of it, but we are. Some of us may not be aware of it, and some of us do. And what does that mean? That if you go to these communities, you will find many commonalities, many traditions in common. And when I founded the chamber, I wanted to not only grow what we're doing here in North America from Wilmington, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, economically, but I wanted to tie us in to our ancestors' knowledge of how to control the water and manage the land to grow the indigo rice, sweetgrass, and sugarcane. From there, we became advocates for the environment and for green renewable energy. Then we founded the Chamber Foundation, which is to raise funds to support the educational programs because it takes a lot of education. Next slide, please. And I'm sure Ms. Long has already gotten into this, but the definition that we use, and you've already heard it, is who are the Gullah Geechee? We are descendants of ancestors who knew how to control the water and manage the land. And Mr. Folk gave us even more detail of what that meant, the impact of it, and what it looks like now. But what does that mean culturally? What it means culturally, on one hand, is we've lost some connection. But if you bear with me, I'm going to say it's an uncovered memory. And the work that we're doing in many ways is bringing back that memory, bringing back our connection to the water, connection to the land. That's not to say that the work is not being done culturally. It has been done for actually decades, but it was very intentional through the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce that we were going to create economic resilience because of that uncovered memory that's happening. Next slide, please. There you go. So the wetlands and the ties that bind. Many things that we see now, I think people they assume they're wetlands and not necessarily understand, especially the tidal rice fields, as Mr. Folk was saying. You say, oh, those are wetlands. They're previously rice fields. And after the Civil War, when the economy changed for many reasons, one, the labor was no longer free, and the hunting plantations came into being. It was the emancipated ancestors who had the knowledge and the skill set to help create that hunting economy. But before the hunting economy, we had the plantation economy, the plantation ecosystem. And if you just click one more time, some other things are going to come up. I did a little animation here, just somewhere. There you go. So we had the enslaved, we had the plantation ecosystem. If you will, skill sets were developed or were already brought into America. And that's very important to understand that there were skill sets already available. That's why our ancestors were kidnapped. They knew how to grow the rice. They knew how to manage the land and control that water to grow the rice. So there were skill sets already in place. On a plantation, if you will, it was a city in and of itself. You just could not drive to the corner store. Everything was on that plantation. So those skill sets became very intense and strong. So all too often when we talk about the rice fields, the wetlands, etc. We have this image of folks in the field or they're in the kitchen, but it was larger than that. During that time, underground economy also developed because the slaves could not eat what they grew and fed to the plantation owner's family. So out in the wetlands, out in the maritime forest were gardens, the secret gardens, the fishing holes, etc. And it created an underground economy because there was bartering happening. And that ties directly back to West Africa, bartering. I have something that you need, you have something I need. So even in the plantation ecosystem, there was an underground economy happening amongst the enslaved. And once they emancipated, they moved forward with that skill set, with that economy, and it became more apparent, in particular in Reconstruction. All right, next. So it's not only about the enslaved, but also the Maroons, and Ms. Long already touched on the Maroons. And if you click again, I have flight or fight. Maroons escaped into the wetlands and created their own ecosystems. And you're going to hear that word a lot from me, their own ecosystem. So it was a flight situation. They escaped, they emancipated themselves. A prime example is the Seminole Native American tribe. When the Spanish made the call out and said, come and help us fight the British, they made the call to other Native American tribes and to the enslaved. The enslaved emancipated themselves, went to Florida, 12 towns were created, and eventually they integrated to become the Seminole Native American tribe. So there was a flight of, I'm going to emancipate myself, and there was a flight of, I hear a call that someone's guaranteeing me emancipation, let me go. That creates Maroons, the folks who are out in the wetlands, out in the maritime forest that you didn't see until you wanted to see them. And they survived by creating their own ecosystem. And then you have the fight. They fought for their freedom once they became emancipated. They joined the Spanish, and even in the American Revolutionary War, they went to the British. We hear about the swamp fox. How did the swamp fox get around in the swamp? The Maroons. All of these are tied together with the enslaved, who are still family members, and then the emancipated. And they all had skill sets, and they were all creating their own ecosystems, whether it was underground or whether it was just hidden in the wetlands and you just could not see it. So another form of underground. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? Well, emancipation happens, and all of these things have been developed, and the recently emancipated, they move off the plantations by and large, not all, but by and large, and they move into the cities, in particular during Reconstruction. And they bring skills, those skill sets with them. So many of us probably heard about Tulsa, Oklahoma as Black Wall Street. There were many Black Wall Streets, if you will. And I actually prefer Black Main Street, because from town to town, these skills were brought into the center of towns. They opened shops, they opened restaurants, seamstress, etc. Because everything that was done on the plantation, they simply brought to town. They became longshoremen because, as Ms. Long said, everything was done on the water. So once you came into town, it just urbanized it, right? And they brought those West African roots and seasonings, etc., and the European roots, and brought them into the towns. And you see that from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Charleston, Savannah, American Beach, Jacksonville, Florida, and so on. And she went and talked about the food. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the food, because that's what most people think about. They think about rice and they think about shrimp and grits, but it has left a huge impact on American culture. The Gullah Geechee culture is very foundational. And it also incorporated seafood. What they understood is that the wetlands were the incubators. That's where the crabs go, and they have the baby crabs and the baby shrimp and all of that before they go out in the ocean and they get bigger or go to the bigger incubators. And they had to maintain these wetlands because that was sustenance. So all of this tied into our foodways and resulted into our famous dishes, gumbo, shrimp and grits, and so on. Next slide, please. But what is Gullah cooking? Just some nice pictures here. I had some other pictures, but collards, red rice, and so on. I didn't include gumbo, so I apologize. I also had another picture. CNN has talked about holiday traditions, New Year's, and they talk about peas and rice. Hoppin' John, excuse me, had a brain freeze there. And I don't use that picture because the beans sit on top of the rice. That is not Gullah. That is not Gullah. Next slide, please. Because Gullah cooking, Gullah food is a slow simmer. It's a mix of everything in the seasoning. Gumbo is a perfect example. Hoppin' John is too, because it's mixed in together. It's simmered and the seasonings are added so you can get all of that richness and goodness of the food. So if you want to define Gullah food, which is the result of the skill sets that we developed because we had to incorporate where we lived, where we were out in those wetlands, hiding our gardens, getting the seafood from those incubators, and gumbo, that slow simmered one pot cooking. That's how you define gumbo. That's how you define, Gullah Geechee food. All right. And it's very foundational because from there you can say soul food and so on. And next slide, please. So how do we modernize this? I talk about ecosystems, the plantation ecosystems, the maroon ecosystems that they created out in those wetlands hidden in the maritime forest. Well, the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce and the work we're doing, we are organizing local ecosystems, helping folks recognize or unlock that memory and recognize that in many ways we carry on those traditions. So if you will, imagine a hub and spoke system in this ecosystem, and each local Gullah community is the hub, and there's spokes from that hub. No spokes. On my left-hand side, community and citizen scientists, the water monitors, marine science, marine biologists. We are all of that, but we may not use the terminology. But I just spent a week with an oyster harvester, a shrimper, a crabber, a fisherman, just talking to them and talking about the ecosystems, talking about nature and climate change, et cetera. And they know what's going on. They understand what's going on. They understand that the wetlands are incubators and we have to sustain them. So they are the scientists, the community scientists, if you will. Then we have the entertainment, the education, storytellers, the foodways, restaurants, catering, Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail, professional services that have to serve this ecosystem. That it's that unlocked memory of the ecosystems of our ancestors. And then we have experiences going out with the oyster harvesters, the shrimpers, the crabbers, the aquaculturists, if you will. And then we have the creator, those who take the sweetgrass and make the baskets. You need water to make the sweetgrass. You need waterways. The sweetgrass is out there and we harvest that to make the sweetgrass basket. So it's all connected to that water system, that waterway, the wetlands. Next slide, please. So what we're doing to modernize it and to help create economic resilience is the Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail, which is promoting Gullah Geechee maritime cultural heritage and enhancing economic resilience through a Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail. It's a tourism destination marketing tool that we're using to globally promote our culture, connection to the water and the waterways, to the wetlands, to the maritime forests, and the rice fields. And next, please. And this is our logo here. This will launch in August 2023. Right now, for the past year and a half, we've been conducting focus groups, interviews to capture their stories and help folks unlock those memories and to recognize that we are carrying on many of our West African traditions from our ancestors. We just don't call it that You know, our parents didn't think to say, what I'm teaching you is Gullah, what I'm teaching you is connected to the waterways. There was some assumptions there that we knew, but we're much more intentional about it now. And that's how we're modernizing those ecosystems from what our kidnapped ancestors brought to the plantation ecosystem, what our maroon ancestors took into the wetlands with them, those maritime forests, and they went into that water, the wetlands, they went into the land to provide the sustenance, excuse me, that we are now actually hoping to monetize on a global scale through the Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail. So we're working, not trying, but we're actually doing it, unlocking those memories so that we can now rather have extraction of wealth, create generational wealth. And next slide, please. Or that might be the last slide. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. All right, well, I want to get to as many questions as we can. We might not hit them all, but could I have my speakers just hang out for a second? I had a question here that I think is good to direct to Travis and Kim, kind of linking the two. Has there been an attempt to compare the LiDAR data with written records or historical records?
Kim?
Okay. Yes, I'm very interested in Dr. Folk's research because we have been looking at numbers of people that I heard someone say something about how many people did it take to move the earth. And we are interested in collecting that data. We are also doing research starting from New England all along the Atlantic seaboard because there's a lot of connections, especially between Rhode Island and South Carolina. I'm just not doing, I'm publishing a book. I have a manuscript due June 29th. So that's been looming over me. And it's basically a survey of the African-American Lowcountry, the history of maritime in the Lowcountry. But I will be calling on Dr. Folk and his team following that to go to the next stage, which is to compare the ecological and scientific data with the humans connecting.
Yeah, I would say that I'd have two answers. One is in the written record, by and large, the diaries that we have are from periods when the rice fields are already established. And so there is some notion of how many slaves it took to manage certain size rice fields. There is very little text during the development phase. And having been in rice fields for a long time in the middle of summer, I can only imagine that the survival rate must have been minimal. And so to put any estimate on the amount of slave labor to create these rice fields, I've never seen anything that would suggest any good number other than it's a lot. The other question is to relate LiDAR to the older plats. We do use those. Where we have them, we'll use them to confirm that there was a rice field here or what sort of shape it took. One interesting thing, next time you land at the Charleston airport, the main runway that runs towards the Ashley River was built over an inland rice field, and the Draytons owned it. And via Drayton Hall, I've gotten a digital copy of that plat, and so that's been added. So it's something we've done as these older plats and maps that show rice fields have popped up. We've taken them back to the data set and say, okay, do we have these? We do. Do we have the right shape? So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Travis and Kim. And thank you to all our speakers. I think for time, we have to hold off on our other questions. We might be able to sort of send some responses in a follow-up, but I just want to share a few quick reminders before we wrap up for the day. All right, so just a reminder that this webinar is the first of a two-part series. The second webinar is going to be about a month from now on Wednesday, June 28th. The registration link is going to be in the chat in just a moment, and we'll send it as a follow-up. So if you're not already signed up, you can register. And then finally, I want to just send another reminder that you will need to complete the evaluation to receive a continuing education certificate. That link is going to be in the chat as well. I'll send it in a follow-up email. You'll also receive a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording and some further reading, additional resources that I'll try to get out by the end of the week. And so with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for attending, a huge thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their time and their knowledge, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks.